Appeal, and now this. I'm Jay Willis, your host for today, senior contributor at The Appeal. And the subject of today's show is the city of Rochester, New York's response to the police killing of Daniel Prude, a Black man who was experiencing a mental health crisis when his brother called 911 for help. Instead, the police cuffed him, put a mesh bag over his head, knelt on his back, and pushed his face into the ground until he stopped breathing. Daniel was brain dead and put on life support and passed away a week later. So we're joined today by Rochester City Council member Mary Lupien, by activist, musician, and public defender Danielle Ponder, and by Free the People Rock organizer Stanley Martin, whose organization obtained and released body cam footage of the police killing. Stanley and Councilmember Lupien joined us earlier this month when that footage was released. So the medical examiner has ruled Daniel's death a homicide, and public pressure forced the Rochester Police Department to suspend the officers involved. They have not been disciplined previously, and one investigator said that the police conduct in this incident appeared to be, and I'm quoting here, appropriate and consistent with their training. Yesterday, WHEC Rochester reported that the police incident report includes a circle around Daniel Prude's name with the words, and again I'm quoting here, "make him a suspect," written beside it. In the months since Daniel's death, protesters have been calling for changes to the Rochester Police Department, which has a long and sordid history of accusations of brutalizing people in its custody. Last week, the police chief and several high-ranking officers resigned, and calls are mounting for Mayor Lovely Warren to resign as well over her and her office's handling of the case. Yesterday, Mayor Warren suspended 2 of her staffers and announced that Monday would be that police chief's last day. Although she has said she found out about this incident from her staffers in August, an email from the police chief suggests she knew about it as earlier as March 23rd, the day police suffocated Daniel. City Hall was occupied by demonstrators just this morning, calling for the arrest of the officers involved. So for an update on sort of what's going on there, I'd like Lupien, pardon me. Last time you were here, we asked you about Mayor Warren's claim that Rochester does not have a policing problem. Since then, as we mentioned, much of the department's leadership has resigned. What's your assessment of Mayor Warren's and the police department's reaction to demonstrations, and obviously the underlying police killing that prompted them since we last spoke?
Yeah, you know, the timeline of what happened with Daniel Prude, you know, he was killed on March 23rd, and George Floyd was killed 2 months later. And during that time, you know, the mayor and the police chief both made statements to the effect that we don't have these kind of problems here. We're not Minneapolis. We're ahead of the curve. And, you know, I think that it was really incredible that the community didn't know about this, but at the same time that our elected leaders were having us believe that, you know, we didn't have any cause for alarm, and that, you know, obviously the community members knew that wasn't true because they're the ones, you know, we're the ones on the streets and we know how our police department has been behaving. And so, you know, I think from even before the community found out about it, this has not been handled well. It's really difficult to say who knew what when. I have my suspicions, of course, but City Council is going to be conducting an investigation into this, into council members, into administration. And yesterday, our mayor announced that she's launching her own investigation, which of course, you know, really should be done by a separate branch of government. The Office of Public Integrity is an office that she is the boss of. And so to ask them to investigate her and her administration, I think is maybe a conflict of interest. As for how they've been handling the protests, it's, you know, from the very start, the Free the People Rock organizers and the family of Daniel Prude really just wanted to attend the press conference. And, you know, they were at City Hall, and then the mayor was scheduled to give remarks and then abruptly canceled them and moved it to an alternate location in an attempt to avoid the organizers and the family. And when it was moved to the public safety building, you know, they had moved it 2 different times, and the organizers were simply trying to attend, and they were arrested, you know, and Stanley especially, more violently arrested. And the officer, when Stanley asked, why am I being arrested? His response was, because you're an idiot. And so I think we can see the level of professionalism shown to our community. And then from that very moment, the immediate militaristic response, with hundreds of officers. Eventually, they brought in the state troopers who came with tanks and dogs, and really at the slightest provocation, and even sometimes no provocation at all, have just unleashed chemical weapons, pepper balls, tear gas on our community, on thousands of protesters in the street. And there's been several, really many injuries now, and there's 2 protesters that it appears that they're going to lose an eye. People have been hit in the head several times, concussions. It's just the level of response has been extremely disproportionate and severe, and it appears that our police department views our community as the enemy.
You mentioned the sort of conflicts of interest that might come up with respect to an investigation into this. What entity or organization would you like to see conduct that would give you confidence in the outcome?
Well, it's really difficult, to think who is the body that can hold the police responsible and accountable for their actions. Because now, after 2 weeks of protesting, it's literally hundreds of hours of police body cam footage to review, blue light cameras, and the city council doesn't have that kind of resources to be able to do that kind of an investigation. We looked at the state attorney general, but really ultimately ended up calling for a Department of Justice investigation, knowing that that's still flawed because of, the administration has shown not a real propensity towards holding departments accountable, but, potentially we'll have a new administration that would be able to do a thorough investigation. But I think it also highlights that we don't have a lot of structures in place to hold departments accountable.
So I understand that the Rochester City Council is considering the expansion of an alternative 911 responder services for situations involving mental illness. I also understand that Free the People Rock has said that the amount of funding for that, a little shy of $250,000, isn't enough, and that should be higher. Councilmember, what's your position on this? How much funding should that non-police emergency response system receive?
I think we need to really fund the mental health response proportionately. The number of calls the police get for mental health and behavioral health emergencies are high. So if we want to truly address them all, we'll need much more funding and staffing. This proposal was very, I guess it was a pivoting of an earlier proposal to do a homicide response team. So they had already kind of gone down this road, and once this happened, we're able to add on a team for mental health crisis. So I think it's a step in the right direction. It has also been stated that it will be dispatched from 911 and not from police, and it will be responding instead of police, not a co-response or after, which is the current mechanisms that we have right now that would have had they been used still failed Daniel Prude. So I think it's a really a good step in the right direction. And I think the way they may be looking at it as a pilot to collect some data and see how it's working. And ultimately it's being designed to fit into whatever overarching system that may be developed in partnership with the county. Because typically the city doesn't really deal with mental health. That's more of a county issue. So while 100% needs to be funded, we need not one team, we probably need 6 teams to meet the needs of the Rochester area, and $300,000 isn't a huge investment. I think it's a start, and we need to continue to push to take the money from the police department, because as we shift responsibilities from the police department to these mobile response units and other types of response, we need to be taking that money out of the police budget.
I understand. So 300,000, not a sufficient amount in your view. Do you have a number that you're going for? And if not, how will you determine what that number is? How will you set that goal?
Yeah, I mean, earlier in June, Free the People Rock really led the charge to shift 50% of the funding to mental health response, to education, to housing, to the community supports that really create the environment for public safety, for violence prevention. So, out of the budget talks came this race commission. It stands for Racial and Structural Equity. And that's really where government entities are looking to birth the solutions and the recommendations for how much money we need to shift. The jury is still out for me on whether or not that will be effective. I think the community also has to put together their own plan outside of the race commission to kind of hold up against, to see whether or not what they end up coming up with is what the community actually wants. So while I don't have a number, I would think 50 million, which would be half of the police budget, is just a drop in the bucket of what we'd actually need to reinvest in the community institutions that have been decimated over the last few decades. That would really contribute to stronger and more healthy communities.
Thank you, Councilmember. Stanley, I want to turn to you next. Thank you for joining us again. So there have been recent public celebrations of Daniel's life by the community and the Prude family. Tell us how Daniel's family is doing, and in your view, how has the city responded to their calls for justice?
So I talk to the Prude family every single day, check in to see how they're doing and to ensure that the people's movement on the ground is grounded in what they deem as healing and justice for the family. Currently, they're outside City Hall right now, demonstrating to ensure that justice is met for Daniel Prude. They feel very angry by the mayor's response. More recently, the mayor has decided to put Mark Simmons in as the interim police chief. He's a man who shot a 13-year-old 3 times when the mother called for mental health assistance. So just seeing this movement asking for accountability and demanding justice, and seeing the city of Rochester's response has been really frustrating for the family. And it doesn't seem like we're being heard. We have very clear demands in line with the family, which include Daniel's law to prevent law enforcement officers from responding to mental health calls, and instead allowing helpers who are better equipped to respond to these calls. So hearing about the city allocating $300,000 to such an important demand, such an important action for change, and making sure people who are mentally ill have a chance to thrive and survive is really upsetting for organizers and for the family. So they're still very angry. We still don't feel heard by lovely Warren and the city of Rochester. And we and the family are committed to demonstrating and being out in the streets and continuing to ask for accountability until all demands are met, especially making sure that the city funds mental health counselors, therapists, community health workers in order to make sure they're successful and really attain the appropriate amount of help for people who call for mental health crises.
So we've talked a little bit about funding for this pilot program. Also, it sounds like in your view, $300,000 is not sufficient given the scope of the need here. How much money do you hope to see committed to that?
So we hope to see at least 50% of the police budgets allocated not only to mental health resources, but housing and social programs that all equate to mental health success and mental health thriving. 300,000 is just simply not enough to have a 24/7 crisis center. We believe this is going to be on the backs of Black and Brown people who will be working for less than a livable wage within this system, when in fact, we know the city has funds. They give $148 million to the police department. That includes pensions. So just reallocating these funds, at least half of them, to mental health, to food, to housing, to community grocery stores, things that really equate to success in mental health. So we're asking for at least half of the budget to be reallocated to mental health resources and Black and Brown communities.
Thanks. I want to turn now briefly, before going to a panel discussion, to Danielle Ponder. Danielle, what has been the experience of public defenders like you in dealing with Rochester police? What dynamics do you see sort of unfolding in those interactions with your clients? Danielle, either we've lost you or you're on mute. There it is.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. The mayor issued a report, her deputy mayor issued a report stating that the Rochester Police Department was callous and that the corruption in this police department, is part of every single piece of it. And we know this in the public defender's office because we see it every day. We see people being victimized for being poor. We see people being brutalized because they spoke back to a police officer. We see people being arrested for things that they should not be arrested for. I've had clients for being arrested for not having a bell on their bike. I had a client who was stopped by the police for failing to use the sidewalk. We consistently see officers upcharge people, meaning perhaps it should be a misdemeanor charge, but instead they charge them with a felony. So the corruption within the Rochester Police Department is well documented. We represent thousands of people every year. And I can tell you that public defenders firsthand have accounts of the brutality, the carelessness, the insensitivity of our police department. This is a fight that was bound to come. And I'm happy the day is finally here to really critique and hopefully dismantle this police department.
In your view, again, from your experience as a public defender, what is sort of the most important item on the reform agenda? And I mean that term as broadly as you want it to be: defunding, dismantling, that sort of thing. What is a change that would provide the most immediate relief, the most immediate justice to your clients?
I think absolutely defunding. The police are over-militarized. They're treated as if they are an army that is at war when they are largely prosecuting people or largely arresting people for misdemeanors. 86% of all arrests in Rochester are misdemeanors, right? So there's only two ways we can get at our police department. We either have to completely end our contract with the Locust Club, which would result in them being disbanded, or we have to defund them, which takes away their power, right? So the majority of the clients that I see in city court are people who are dealing with drug addictions, people who are dealing with mental health issues, and they're committing low-level offenses, or family members that have, inter-family disputes. None of these people need the court system. None of them need police. What they actually need is community support, mental health, drug rehabilitation centers. So I think shifting what the police currently have, which is at $148 million, into community supports will have a profound effect, because the criminal justice system is reactive to what policing do, what police do. We only have our courts and our jails and our DAs and our PDs because of what happens out on the streets. So if you can change that, you will dramatically change our whole criminal justice system.
Thank you. I want to open these next couple questions up to the panel. So again, if you've got something to chip in here, please feel free to raise your hand on my Zoom grid view here. But I'll start with you, Stanley. You recently said, I'm quoting here, "At this point, we are just feeling betrayed and traumatized by a Black woman being one of the main oppressors of the Black community." And as I mentioned earlier, an email recently published from the police chief suggests that Mayor Warren knew about the police action against Daniel on the same day that it happened. So bluntly, in your view, does Mayor Warren have the trust of the people of Rochester? In your view, should she resign?
I think she has lost all the trust from the people of Rochester, just based on the actions she's taken over the past few weeks, hiding the video, not coming out and telling the public, saying that the Attorney General said she shouldn't release it, and the Attorney General stating clearly, "I never said these things." We believe that at this point, we've just lost all faith. Her actions have been in support of the police and not the people. She sat back and watched while the police came into our communities and tear gassed violently, and pepper sprayed us, beat us with batons. I've been beaten, I've been pepper sprayed, I've been chased by the police, and there needs to be some accountability, and we do not see that coming from Mayor Lovely Warren. So at this point, we need someone who can step in and listen to the voices of the people and actually ensure that policies are in line with what the people are asking for and policies that keep us safe.
Councilmember, we've talked about the proposals to cut up to 50% of the police budgets and reallocate it to other programs. Where are your city council colleagues on this? What is it going to take to get a proposal like that over the finish line? I understand that the most recent proposal, and please correct me if I'm wrong, from the Rochester City Council was a 3.7% budget cut. Obviously, there's a pretty significant delta between that and 50. So what's it take to get it there?
Yeah, the budget cut was really minimal. The total amount was really more about COVID related, lack of revenue or lack of need of police. We did shift 750,000, 300, and that is the bucket which this 300,000 is coming from to fund the family and crisis intervention expansion that we're voting on this month. So my colleagues at the time, I think 2 out of the remaining 7 were on some level of, knowing that this needed to happen, but maybe now isn't the moment. We didn't have a plan. And so that's what the race commission was supposed to be, to come up with that plan. But it very quickly became about all of racial and structural inequity in both the city and the county. So it really lost its focus on coming up with a plan to reallocate resources from the police department. Where they are at now, I'm not sure. I've seen a real shift in my colleagues in an openness to thinking about, other methods of policing, other methods of public safety than they were in June. Example, last month, there was a police substation that we were going to bond $12.5 million. Their total project cost of $16 million to build this police substation and service center. And there was we had 2 hours of public commentary, and a lot of community members spoke against the project, and it still passed. However, this month, 2 of the members that voted for it and myself are co-sponsoring legislation to repeal it, which looks like, all but one of our colleagues will be on board with. So already we've seen a shift, and there's, been talk of, well, if I knew then what I knew now, I, lost faith in the administration. Now's not the time to borrow this amount of money. Things have really shifted. So, we haven't had the conversation around defunding since that time, but I would suspect that now is the moment where if ever we were going to have this happen with this current sitting council, now would be the time. That said, we have an election next year, and I know that a lot of the people who are on the streets every night are the same people we're going to see running, and I definitely welcome new blood, progressive ideas, and new candidates to run for council.
Thank you. I want to open up to all of you and sort of get your thoughts on something that a dynamic that Councilmember you just touched on, which is that we're seeing in Rochester and in cities across the country real powerful movement to reform, defund, dismantle police departments, but it often comes in response to tragedies, to police killings of Black and brown people. That's what it takes to get the ball rolling. And while it's good that that ball gets rolling, it's deeply sad that there's a cost in human life to initiating that conversation. From your experience over the past several weeks, months, what can activists, politicians, community leaders do to initiate this change in places without a tragedy, to prevent it from happening in the first place? How do you get public attention focused on issues like this?
Well, it is really difficult. And, I've only been in office for 9 months now, but one thing I can say is that the power of the status quo is powerful, and electeds tend not to want to step out on a ledge. There's safety in the way things are. And I think the power of demonstration, you don't need to have an event like what happened with Daniel Prude to be a catalyst for demonstration. When the defund conversation, there was a lot of mobilization. I received 1,000 emails from members of this community. And I think that pushed some people, but the power of civic engagement, the power of the community sharing its voice and tying it to electoral politics. I think and it's been expressed to me that, oh, well, they always say they're going to vote us out and then they don't. And so I think it's really powerful to show, to demonstrate that, no, this isn't just people shouting in the street. This is a legislative an electoral strategy that, if our elected leaders don't do what the people are asking, then, there's consequences. And I think ultimately that is what moves elected officials to do things that are uncomfortable and maybe new, and kind of moving in more bold ways.
Thank you. Stanley and Danielle, I'll ask you the same question. What sort of lessons do you derive from your experience for activists elsewhere?
So I would say that, it doesn't take anyone's death to get out to the street. I would almost bet money that if you live in a mid to large city, the police budget is bloated, and your police are not well trained, because the issues with policing are actually are nationwide, right? I looked at a smaller town here, Arundecoy, and it was the same thing. A bloated police budget when police are largely dealing with minor petty crimes that root from crises that people are having. I read an article the other day that was really powerful that says we expect police to be social workers, but we train them like a military occupying force. So before we knew of Daniel Prude's death, we were organizing in Rochester, and Free the People was organizing, looking at the police budget. So I would implore all of the activists to look at your budget, look at what your police are actually doing, and let that be the thing that motivates you to get to the street. You can go out in the streets with those numbers. You don't have to wait for a tragedy to happen.
Absolutely. And I want to just echo what Danielle says. I think it's just really sad that our elected officials seem to only act when a tragedy happens. Like Danielle was saying earlier, for the past 16 weeks and prior to this, there has been a strong legacy of organizing here in the city of Rochester. We have been demanding that the police be defunded and people in Black and Brown communities actually be given tools, housing, food, education to survive and thrive. So the response now is just even more disappointing, especially with them knowing this for 6 months and not saying anything or doing anything and still scrambling to make adjustments. So like Danielle was saying, just continue to get out in the streets, do your research. Just know that the police lie, they always have and they always will. So questioning anything that has to do with the police. And we also know that certain offices like the mayor's office essentially has the police as an arm to protect her office and her power. So recognizing those connections and attacking the discrepancies between those are so important. So just keep going out there, keep organizing, keep fighting. Voting is important, but also the power of the people in the streets and holding people accountable is equally as important.
I think that's a strong place to leave it for now. I want to thank all of our guests for joining us today. This is certainly a fascinating story to watch, and it's instructive, as we've been saying, not just in terms of its place within the police violence crisis, but also in terms of how elected officials play a role in enabling that violence or holding law enforcement accountable, as the case may be. To our viewers at home, thanks again for watching. We'll be live again in a half hour at 2:30 Eastern to talk about Virginia's evictions cliff amid the COVID-19 pandemic. I want to invite everybody, if you haven't already, follow Appeal News on Facebook and The Appeal on Twitter for the latest updates. This has been The Briefing. I'm Jay Willis.